Hello, everyone. Now, as you know, Michael Jordan fans are the worst sports fans of all time, and one of the many reasons why is because they're always acting like the NBA from the 1980s and 1990s is the number one NBA era of all time, the golden era, the best era, and there are more examples, but you get the point. But are they really that into the NBA from the 1980s and the 1990s? They're not. And I'm going to show it to you. Let's go over some things. Here are some examples in no particular order. First, let's start with some logic. You know, most Michael Jordan fans are not NBA experts, so why would they all of a sudden be an expert for the 1980s? And then, why would they all of a sudden be an expert for the 1990s? So if they are not an expert, then they are not that into it. Sure, you could say, well, hey, a person may not be an NBA expert, but they could be an NBA expert of the 1980s and or the 1990s. Sure, that's possible, but that won't apply to Michael Jordan fans. They are not NBA experts of the 1980s and or the 1990s. Next, most sports fans and most people who are fans of things that don't have to do with sports usually like what they grew up with the most. And you know, there are tons of Michael Jordan fans who didn't grow up with the 1980s and or the 1990s. So they are not going to be that into the 1980s and or the 1990s. Next, when someone is growing up and they really like something, they're usually not going to like it to the same level for about 20 years. Next, imagine a world when YouTube was not around. Most Michael Jordan fans are not going to be as into the 1980s and 1990s as they are today. Next, imagine a world when there was no internet. Most Michael Jordan fans are not going to be as into the 1980s and 1990s as they are today. So that's some logic. So now let's continue. Next, most Michael Jordan fans usually like one decade more than the other. So some might like the 1980s more than the 1990s, and some might like the 1990s more than the 1980s. If a Michael Jordan fan grew up in the 1980s, they would be more into the 1980s than the 1990s. If a Michael Jordan fan grew up in the 1990s, they would be more into the 1990s than the 1980s. And if a Michael Jordan fan was not growing up in the 1980s or the 1990s, they would be more into the 1990s than the 1980s. Next, let's go over a general thing about each decade. First, the 1980s. They usually like the late 1980s. Now let's go over the 1990s. They are more into the mid-1990s and the late 1990s. Next, when it comes to the 1980s, they usually only bring up 3 stars: Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan. That's it. These are the 3 stars they usually bring up. They have a whole league out there, and they usually only bring up these 3 stars. They think these 3 stars were the best players in the 1980s. They think these 3 stars dominated the most. They call these 3 stars the Trinity of the NBA when it comes to the 1980s. And these are their favorites. Every time they have a list of the best players of the 1980s, the list may not be the same with all of them, but these 3 will always be there. Now sure, Michael Jordan fans know there were other stars. They know some names, and they know some information, but they don't bring up the other stars that much, and they don't bring them up as much as Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan. And when they bring up certain stars, it's usually the stars the media brings up more, or the stars that also played a lot in the 1990s. Here, I'll show you. After Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan, what stars do they usually bring up? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Dominique Wilkins, Isaiah Thomas, James Worthy, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Kevin McHale, Reggie Miller, Hakeem Olajuwon, Gary Payton, Clyde Drexler, Scottie Pippen, Charles Barkley, and there are more examples, but you get the point. These are the names that the media brings up a lot, and most of them played in the 1990s, and some of them played lots of years in the 1990s. Think about some of the stars who played in the 1980s and the 1990s, and whom Michael Jordan fans bring up a lot. For example, Reggie Miller, Dominique Wilkins, Hakeem Olajuwon, Scottie Pippen, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Clyde Drexler, and there are more examples, but you get the point. They know more about these players from the 1990s than they do the 1980s. They know more information about these players from the 1990s than the 1980s. They know more about the highlights in the 1990s than the 1980s. They know more about the awards that were won in the 1990s than the 1980s. And there are more examples, but you get the point. After Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan, when they bring up other stars from the 1980s, they don't know that many details about them. What do they know? They know basic information, what team the star played for, they have an idea of some statistics, they might know some awards, and there are more examples, but you get the point. For example, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, what do they know about him in the 1980s? They know the basic information. They know he is tall, he played the center position, he played for the Los Angeles Lakers, he was older, they have an idea of some of his statistics, and they know that he was on some teams that won. That is pretty much it. They don't know most of the players who guarded him. They don't know most of the players he guarded. They don't know how some players did against him. They don't know how he did against some players. They don't know most of his statistics. They don't know most of his records. They don't know most of his awards. And they don't know about any main highlights of him. Another example, Dominique Wilkins. What do they know about him in the 1980s? They know he is a small forward. He played for the Atlanta Hawks. Some of them don't even know that he did not stay with that franchise. They know he could dunk. They know he was in at least one dunk contest where it came down to him and Michael Jordan. And that is pretty much it. And since they love highlights, ask yourself, what highlights do they know about? They played some of his dunks that he made in games, and they don't have any main highlights of him. Maybe some know about the time that he dunked on Larry Bird, but most do not. And some of them played his dunks in the slam dunk contest when it came down to him and Michael Jordan. They know he never won a ring. Another example, Isaiah Thomas. What do they know about him in the 1980s? They know he was not that tall when it comes to the NBA. They know he was a point guard. They know he played for the Detroit Pistons. They know a few of his statistics like scoring and assists. They think he led the way to freezing out Michael Jordan at an All-Star game. They have a few highlights of him dribbling and even less highlights of him scoring and passing. That's it. He came in 1981. They don't know much about him in the early 1980s. They know more about him in the late 1980s. Another example, Reggie Miller. What do they know? They know he played on the Indiana Pacers. They have an idea of some of his statistics, and they hardly know about any of his highlights. That's it. Another example, John Stockton. What do they know? They know he played on the Utah Jazz, and he made nice passes, and they hardly know about any of his highlights. That's it. Another example, Karl Malone. What do they know? They know he played on the Utah Jazz. They have an idea of some of his statistics. They hardly know about any of his highlights. That's it. Another example, Clyde Drexler. What do they know? They know he played for the Portland Trail Blazers. They know some of his statistics, and they hardly know of any of his highlights. That's it. And there are more examples, but you get the point. They just know basic information. Now, some Michael Jordan fans are going to think that they know about the stars because they're thinking about the 1990s. But remember, we're referring to the 1980s. This is how they are with stars the media brings up more. And this is how they are with stars that played lots of years in the 1990s. So what do you think is going to happen with stars that the media brings up less? What do you think is going to happen with stars that did not play that many years in the 1990s? They will know about them less. They will know less about their highlights. They will bring them up less. And there are more examples, but you get the point. Here, let me give you some examples. Artis Gilmore, Adrian Dantley, Alex English, Elvin Hayes, Jamal Wilkes, Norm Nixon, Eddie Johnson, Moses Malone, John Drew, Dan Roundfield, Tiny Archibald, Michael Ray Richardson, World B. Free, Jack Sikma, Paul Westphal, Walter Davis, Scott Wedman, Kermit Washington, Otis Birdsong, Reggie Theus, Bobby Jones, Mike Mitchell, Truck Robinson, Sidney Moncrief, Buck Williams, Kelly Tripucka, Bob Lanier, Gus Williams, Lonnie Shelton, Bernard King, Maurice Cheeks, Andrew Toney, Maurice Lucas, David Thompson, Kiki Vandeweghe, and there are more examples, but you get the point. They don't know about most of these players. If they know something or some things about any of these players, they know very little. They don't usually bring these players up, and they don't bring these players up as much as Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan. Some of them don't know Dr. J played in the 1980s. Some of them know he did, but they don't think he played that many years in the 1980s. Some of them know he did, but they don't know that he played most of the 1980s. They don't know that he played all the way until 1987, and that in his last season, he was still really good. And if they know these things, they don't know that he was an all-star every time in the 1980s. They think of him as a 1970s player. They don't know that his numbers were still pretty much the same in the early 1980s, and that he sacrificed his scoring. And they don't know that later in the decade, when his scoring went down, the rest of his numbers were pretty much the same. He was still a pretty good player. They don't know that he played lots of games against Michael Jordan. Some of them don't know George Gervin played in the 1980s. Some of them know he did, but they don't think he played that many years in the 1980s. Some of them know he did, but they don't know that he played most of the 1980s. They don't know that he played all the way until 1986, and that in his last season, he was still really good, and that when he retired, he was only 33 or 34, and that after he retired, he was playing professional basketball in Italy. And if they know these things, they don't know that he was an all-star every time in the 1980s except in his last season. They think of him as a 1970s player. They don't know that his numbers were still pretty much the same in the early 1980s. And they don't know that later in the decade, when his scoring went down, the rest of his numbers were pretty much the same. He was still a pretty good player. They don't know that his minutes went down. They don't know that he played some games against Michael Jordan. They don't know that in his last season, he played with the Chicago Bulls. And in his last season, he played with Michael Jordan. They don't know that Pete Maravich played in the 1980s. Sure, he did not play that long in the 1980s, but he was still there. And in the 1980s, he played less games. And when he retired, he was only 32 or 33. So it was theoretically possible for him to play more years in the 1980s. And yet they label him as a 1970s player. And they act like he played at a time that was not that good. Now here's the thing. Even when it comes to Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan in the 1980s, they don't know that much about them either. What do they know? Let's start with Magic Johnson. Let's start with the early 1980s. What do they know? They know he is 6'9". They know he was a point guard. They know he came in 1979. They know he was on the Los Angeles Lakers. They know there was an NBA Finals where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was injured and Magic Johnson filled in at the center position, and he played every position, and he put up monster numbers, and he won the NBA Finals MVP award, and the Lakers won the NBA Finals that year. They have an idea of some of his statistics. They know he won some awards. They know he was on lots of teams that won. They know he had a rivalry with Larry Bird. And there are more examples, but you get the point. They know basic information. They don't know the details when it comes to 1979 and the early 1980s. They don't know that he came into the NBA at 19. They don't know that he won the NBA Finals MVP award when he was 20. They don't know who guarded him other than Larry Bird. They don't know who he guarded other than Larry Bird. They don't know most of the awards he won. They don't know when he won them. They don't know that he twice led the league in highest steals per game average. And what about highlights? They don't have that many main highlights of him in the early 1980s. There are basically two highlights the media has shown over and over. The first has the type of quality that they showed in the 1970s, and it is in slow motion. And it is him celebrating with his teammates after a game, and he is smiling. The other is him celebrating with his team after a game and him hugging Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. That's it. That's just the early 1980s. Michael Jordan fans do not learn that much more when it comes to the mid-1980s. They don't get that many more highlights either. Then when it comes to the late 1980s, Michael Jordan fans learned some more things, but not that much more. They know he was on a team that won in 1987 and 1988. They know he was on teams that won back-to-back championships. And when it comes to the highlights, it's usually one main highlight that they know, maybe two. The one they usually get is him making that hook shot in Boston. The other one that they might know is him making the three-point shot in Boston. That's it. So they don't really know that much about Magic Johnson. They just know general things. Now let's go to Larry Bird. Let's start with the early 1980s. What do they know? They know he came in 1979. They know he was on the Boston Celtics. They know he was a small forward. They have an idea of some of his statistics. They know he won some awards. They don't know when he won the awards. They don't know all of the awards. And they know he was on some teams that won. And highlights? They have one. The time he was standing up in front of where his bench is, and he was flying his towel around. That's it. Then when it came to the mid-1980s, not much changed. Then when it came to the late 1980s, they played some more highlights. And the main one that they know about is the time that he stole the ball in Boston. That's it. So they don't know that much about Larry Bird. They just know general things. Now let's go to Michael Jordan. Let's start with the early 1980s. They will know a little bit about his statistics. They know he won the Rookie of the Year award. They think he was on a team that had no help. And they don't have any main highlights. That is pretty much it. Then when it came to the mid-1980s, they start to learn a little more. They know a little bit more about his statistics. They know a little bit more about his awards. They still think he was on teams that sucked. And when it comes to highlights, They have one main highlight, the time where he was dribbling under his legs in Boston and Larry Bird was one of the defenders and then he scored. That's it. Then when it comes to the late 1980s, they start to learn more things. They know more about his statistics. They know more about his awards. They still think he was on teams that had no help. They know he was in more than one dunk contest. They know in at least one dunk contest, it came down to him and Dominique Wilkins. They know that he won at least one dunk contest, and they have some more highlights. There was the one where he scored in Cleveland, and there was the dunk that he did in the slam dunk contest that was from the free throw line. That's it. So they did not know that much about Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan in the 1980s, especially if you go even more back in time in the 1980s. Now, when the internet came, not that much changed. When the internet became more popular, they learned about some more information, more highlights, more stories, and things like that. But not much changed. When YouTube became more popular, they learned about some more information, more highlights, more stories, and things like that. But not much changed. They did learn more about Larry Bird stories. And by the way, part of the reason that Larry Bird stories became so popular is because I was putting so many on the page known as the Universe Galaxy, and those videos were very popular. Now that was the players. Now let's go to teams of the 1980s. What do they know? They always bring up the Los Angeles Lakers, the Boston Celtics, and the Detroit Pistons. That's it. You have a whole league out there, and these are the three teams that they bring up. They bring these teams up because the media brings these teams up. Sure, these teams won a lot of games, but so did lots of other teams. Sure, these teams won lots of rings, but if they are going to act like they like the 1980s, then they should like more than just the teams that won rings. And even if you go by the teams that won rings, the Lakers won 5. That means the other half they did not win. The Celtics won 3. That means for 7 years they did not win. The Detroit Pistons won 1. That means for 9 years they did not win. Sure, sometimes when these teams were not winning, they were still going to the NBA Finals. But the Philadelphia 76ers went to the NBA Finals, and Michael Jordan fans do not bring them up that much. The Houston Rockets went to the NBA Finals, but Michael Jordan fans do not bring them up that much. And if they are going to count going to the NBA Finals, why stop there? Why not count going to the third round, and the second round, and the first round, and how many games a team wins in the regular season? Lots of teams won in the 1980s, but Michael Jordan fans do not usually bring up those teams. There were lots of good teams in the 1980s, but Michael Jordan fans do not usually bring up other teams. Then there are the Chicago Bulls. They don't know how Michael Jordan actually had some good players on his teams in the 1980s, how he actually had some good teams in the 1980s. They don't know that he had some teams that were above 500. They don't know that some of his teams did well in the playoffs. They know he had teams in the playoffs, but they don't know all the details about what happened with every team. They just know that eventually the teams lost. They just know about the Los Angeles Lakers, the Boston Celtics, and the Detroit Pistons. That's it. But they don't even know that much about these teams either. Let's start with the Los Angeles Lakers. What do they know? They know some teams were coached by Pat Riley, and some teams had Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy, and they know some of the other role players. They know the teams won a lot. They know the teams sometimes did fast breaks, and they know the teams had a nickname called Showtime. That's it. What else do they know? Most of them did not play every NBA Finals from the 1980s that had the Los Angeles Lakers from start to finish. They don't know a lot about the regular season games. They don't know a lot about the playoff games. They don't know a lot about the NBA Finals games. They just know general things, and they play some highlights. They don't know that in the early 1980s, it was considered Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's team and not Magic Johnson's team. They think every year the Lakers had a super team, but they don't know most of the players on the rosters. They don't know what the starting lineups were sometimes in the NBA Finals. For example, they don't know that there were starting lineups in the NBA Finals that had Kurt Rambis, AC Green, and Michael Cooper. Great players, but not super team type of players. They don't know much about the early 1980s Los Angeles Lakers with Jamal Wilkes and Norm Nixon and Bob McAdoo. They don't know much about the playoff series with the Los Angeles Lakers and George Gervin's San Antonio Spurs. They don't know much about the playoff series with the Los Angeles Lakers and the Utah Jazz. They don't know much about the playoff series with the Los Angeles Lakers and the Phoenix Suns. And there are more examples, but you get the point. They don't know much about the NBA Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Philadelphia 76ers. They don't know much about the NBA Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Boston Celtics. They don't know much about the NBA Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Detroit Pistons. Now let's try the Boston Celtics. They know even less. They know about Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, less know about Robert Parrish, and less know about Danny Ainge. That's it. They don't know what was going on in 1979, They don't know much about the teams in the early 1980s. They don't know much about the NBA Finals that the Boston Celtics had with the Houston Rockets the first time. They don't know much about the NBA Finals that the Boston Celtics had with the Los Angeles Lakers the first time. They don't know much about the NBA Finals that the Boston Celtics had with the Houston Rockets the second time. They just know very general things. Now let's go to the Detroit Pistons. They know less. Now when the internet came, not much changed. They got some more information, more highlights, and more stories, and that was pretty much it. Then when the internet got more popular, not much changed. They got some more information, more highlights, and more stories, and that was pretty much it. Then when YouTube got more popular, not much changed. They got more information, more highlights, and more stories, and that was pretty much it. They know that they were the bad boys, and they were physical, and they hurt players, and they were tough. And they were tough on Michael Jordan. Now that's the teams. Now what about the rest of the NBA in the 1980s? They don't know who most of the owners were. They don't know who most of the general managers were. They don't know who most of the coaches were. They don't know who most of the non-star players were. They don't know most of the rules that were changed. They don't know when teams were added to the NBA. They don't know about most of the All-Star games. And they don't know about most of the All-Star weekends. So that is the 1980s. Now let's go to the 1990s. They know more about the 1990s compared to the 1980s, but they don't know that much more. What do they know? If you can, go back to when YouTube was less famous. If you can, go back to when the internet was less famous. And if you can, go back to when there was no internet. Let's start with the players. They know the names of the famous stars. They know Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Gary Payton, Clyde Drexler, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, and there are more examples, but you get the point. But they know more about these stars in the mid-1990s and the late 1990s. They know less about them in the early 1990s. Then when it comes to the stars they know, what do they know? They know some information, they know some statistics, they know some highlights, and things like that, but they don't know that many details. They don't bring up all the stars around the same amount of times. Certain stars they bring up way more than others. For example, they will bring up Michael Jordan and Hakeem Olajuwon way more than they bring up Gary Payton and John Stockton. The stars that they know about are the stars that the media brings up more. So there were stars that they know less about. For example, Jamal Mashburn, Jim Jackson, Vin Baker, Glenn Robinson, Rod Strickland, Mitch Richmond, Nick Van Exel, Vlade Divac, Cedric Sabalas, Tim Hardaway, Chris Mullin, Fat Lever, Tom Chambers, Rolando Blackman, Kevin Johnson, Ricky Pierce, Hersey Hawkins, Brad Daugherty, Alvin Robertson, Kevin Duckworth, Terry Porter, Dan Marlin, Dikembe Mutombo, Otis Thorpe, Reggie Lewis, Mark Price, Michael Adams, Kevin Willis, Danny Manning, Sean Elliott, Sean Kemp, Larry Johnson, Detlef Schrempf, Larry Nance, and there are more examples, but you get the point. They learn a lot about Michael Jordan, but even with him, they don't learn as many things as they could. So they know even less about the players who are not stars. That's the players. What about the teams? They know about the Chicago Bulls. Some know a few things about the Houston Rockets. Some know a few things about the Utah Jazz. And that is pretty much it. Even when it comes to the teams that they don't know that much. Let's start with the Chicago Bulls. What do they know? They know the main guys. They know how many rings they had. They know they had a season where they won 72 games, and they know about some of the teams they played in the NBA Finals. And the only reason they learned all this is because they were learning about Michael Jordan. The few who know some things about the Houston Rockets don't know much about them, except that it had Hakeem Olajuwon. Some might know about some of the other players, and some of them know that they won 2 rings. And the only reason they know that is because they were learning about Michael Jordan. The few who know some things about the Utah Jazz know that the team had John Stockton and Karl Malone, and they know that those teams never won a ring. And they know that those teams played the Chicago Bulls in the NBA Finals, and that is pretty much it. And the only reason they know these things is because they were learning about Michael Jordan. They don't know every team that the Chicago Bulls played in the NBA Finals. If they do, they don't know that much about every team that the Chicago Bulls played in the NBA Finals. They don't know much about the NBA Finals in 1994 and in 1995. They don't know much about the NBA Finals in 1999. They don't know much about the regular season games. They don't know much about the playoff games. They don't know much about the New Jersey Nets or the Seattle Supersonics or the Vancouver Grizzlies or the Minnesota Timberwolves or the Sacramento Kings or the Los Angeles Clippers or the New York Knicks, and there are more examples, but you get the point. That's the teams. Now, what about the rest of the NBA? They don't know who most of the owners were. They don't know who most of the general managers were. They don't know who most of the coaches were. They don't know what new teams came into the NBA. If they do, they don't know what year. They don't know what rules were changed. They don't know much about the All-Star games. They don't know much about the All-Star weekends. When the internet came, not much changed. They learned some more information, some more highlights, some more stories, and that was pretty much it. When the internet got more popular, not much changed. They learned some more information, some more highlights, some more stories, and that was pretty much it. When YouTube got more popular, not much changed. They got some more information, some more highlights, some more stories, and that was pretty much it. Hey, please subscribe, and if you disagree with me on something, you can go on my program and show me your facts on whatever you disagree on. If you want to go on, let's set it up. Send me an email. The email is right there in the description section. Thank you.